The man's name was Harlan Dryce, and he wore his cruelty the way other men wore their Sunday suits, pressed clean and proud, without a single wrinkle of shame. He came riding into Caldwell, Kansas on a bright October morning in 1883, and the dust that rose behind his black horse was the color of a bad omen. Opal Lawson saw him from the window of the farmhouse before he had even reined his horse to a stop, and every nerve in her body fired at once. Every instinct she'd spent 2 years sharpening in the brutal school of widowhood told her to run. But her feet had gone cold as iron, and she stood there, gripping the windowsill with both hands, watching the man who had stolen everything from her husband ride up to the home that was rightfully hers. Harlan Dryce stepped down from his horse with the unhurried confidence of a man who already owned whatever he was looking at. He smoothed his black frock coat, adjusted the gold pin at his collar, and reached into the interior of his coat with 2 fingers. He pulled out a folded document, thick and stamped with official wax, and he held it up between 2 fingers like a gambler revealing a winning card. Even from the window, Opal could see the gleam in his pale eyes, that cold, triumphant gleam that told her this was not a visit. This was an eviction. She could not speak. Her throat had sealed itself shut. 2 years of grief and struggle rose up in her chest all at once, 2 years of broken winters, of patching the roof alone, of blistering her hands on a plow because there was nobody left to do it for her, of telling herself that the land was hers and that no one could take that away. 2 years of believing that Robert's death had at least left her the ground beneath her feet. She reached for the door handle, and then the door opened before she could touch it. Edgar Quinn stepped through it from the outside, and he positioned himself on the front porch with a quiet, deliberate certainty that was more powerful than any shout. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a jaw set like quarried stone and dark eyes that held the look of a man who had already decided something and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. His hat was pulled low. His hands were at his sides, empty but absolutely still. He faced Harlan Dryce across 10 feet of yard, and he said nothing at all. He simply stood there between Opal and the man who had come to destroy her. Harlan Dryce stopped walking, his lip pulled back in something that was not quite a smile. "Step aside, Cowboy," Dryce said. "This is a matter of law." Edgar Quinn did not move so much as a single inch. Opal pressed her palm flat against the door that Edgar had just come through, and she felt the wood warm under her touch, and she thought, in the way that desperate people sometimes think impossible things, that she had never in her life been so grateful for the presence of another human being. She still could not speak, but for the first time in 2 years she did not feel alone. This is how things had arrived at this moment. This is the story of how one widow fought to keep her land, how one man chose her side before she had even asked him to, and how the most unexpected truth of all turned out to be that the heart, even a broken one, could still find its way home. 14 months before Harlan Dryce rode back into Opal's life, the ground beneath her feet had already been crumbling in ways she could not yet name. Robert Lawson had been dead for 2 years and 4 months when the first letter arrived. 2 years and 4 months was enough time to stop expecting his boots by the door, and still enough time to feel the absence of them as a kind of physical pain, low and persistent, like something that had healed badly. Opal was 28 years old that autumn, and she was strong in the way that necessity makes a person strong, not because she had wanted to be, but because there had been no other choice. The farm sat on 120 acres of good grassland in Sumner County, Kansas, close enough to the cattle trails that you could sometimes hear the distant lowing of herds passing through, but far enough out from Caldwell proper that the silence at night was absolute and occasionally terrifying. Robert had bought the land in 1878 with 5 years of savings from trail driving and a loan from his uncle, and he had loved it with the evangelical fervor of a man who had never owned anything before. He had worked it with his whole body and soul, and he had died at the end of 1881, when the gray mare threw him in a creek bed in January, and the cold did the rest. He left Opal the land, the farmhouse, a team of horses, 30 head of cattle, and a debt she did not discover until 3 months after the funeral. The debt was the thing Harlan Dryce had been waiting for. Opal had first encountered Harlan Dryce through Robert's stories, the way you encounter a villain in a book before the book becomes your life. Dryce was a land speculator out of Wichita who had been buying up failed homesteads and distressed properties across southern Kansas for the better part of a decade. He was clever, he was connected, and he was patient the way a trap is patient. Robert had borrowed $250 from Dryce in 1880 to replace the roof after a hailstorm, and the terms of the loan had been written in such a way that upon the borrower's death, the debt would be callable in full within 18 months, or the creditor could claim a lien on the property. Robert had not told Opal about the loan. She did not know whether it was because he had planned to repay it quietly, or because he had been ashamed, or because he had simply believed that he had more time. The reason didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that when the 18 months expired in the early summer of 1883, Opal did not have $250, and Harlan Dryce had a legal document that said what that meant for her farm. She had spent that first year after Robert's death just surviving the harvest, the winter, the spring planting, the relentless arithmetic of keeping a farm going alone. She had hired a boy from town for 2 seasons to help with the heavy work, a 15-year-old named Willis who was earnest and willing but no substitute for an experienced hand. She had made what she could on cattle sales and wheat. She had patched and mended and rationed and refused to break, because breaking felt like a betrayal of everything Robert had worked for, and because she was not, at her core, a woman who bent easily. She had also been too proud and too alone to tell anyone how close to the edge she was standing. The first letter from Dryce's attorney arrived in July of 1883. It was written in the dry, suffocating language of legal instruments, and it informed her of the existence of the debt, of the lien provision, and of the fact that payment was now past due. It requested that she remit the sum of $250 plus interest, which had now accumulated to $310 within 60 days, or face formal proceedings. Opal read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table, and then she set it down very carefully, as if it were a living thing, and she stared at the wall for a long time. $310. She had 47. She wrote back to the attorney. She asked for an extension. She said she would have the money by spring. The reply that came 3 weeks later was polite and absolute. No extension would be granted. The terms of the instrument were clear. She went to the bank in Caldwell and explained her situation to Harold Greer, who was the bank president and who had known Robert well enough to attend his funeral. Harold Greer expressed what seemed to be genuine sympathy, and then told her that the bank could not issue a loan against a property with an existing lien. She went to the county clerk's office and asked to see the original document. It was exactly as described, signed in Robert's own hand, notarized by a Kansas City firm, and utterly, depressingly valid. She rode home in the wagon in the late afternoon light and let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly the length of that ride. When she reached the farm, she unhitched the horses, put them in the barn, went inside and made herself dinner. Then she sat down and made a list. There were people in Sumner County who owed Robert Lawson small debts, a side of beef here, a day's labor there, the kind of informal obligations that ran through frontier communities like underground rivers. There was the beef she had coming to market in October. There was the possibility of selling the south pasture, though that would mean a permanent reduction in what the farm could carry. There was, and she hated this idea, hated it with a physical revulsion, the possibility of asking for help. It was during this period of grim accounting that she first encountered Edgar Quinn, though the encounter was so unremarkable at the time that she did not think of it again for 2 weeks. He had come to buy a horse. A neighbor of hers, Henry Calloway, who ran the adjacent property 3 miles to the east, had put the word out that he had 2 mares to sell, and various men from around the county and down from Wichita had come to look at them. Opal had ridden over to speak to Henry about borrowing his thrashing equipment, and Edgar Quinn had been there in the corral, evaluating a chestnut mare with the focused attention of a man who took his horses seriously. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from a life spent outdoors. He had a quietly observant quality. He watched things carefully without appearing to stare, and when he spoke, which was not often, the words were chosen and exact. He had been hired on at the Morrison cattle operation north of Caldwell 2 months prior, which was how Opal knew his name. Morrison's men were a known quantity in the county, generally hardworking and honest, which put them above average in Opal's estimation. He had noticed her arrival and tipped his hat. She had nodded back. Henry had poured coffee and they had all talked for 20 minutes about nothing consequential: the weather, the condition of the fall market, whether the Santa Fe line was going to extend further west. Edgar Quinn had bought the mare for $42, shaken Henry's hand and ridden off. Opal had thought, capable-seeming man, and then she had turned her full attention back to her problem. The summer wore on hot and merciless. She sold 2 steers in August and raised $60. She tracked down 2 of the men who owed Robert small debts and collected another $30 in goods and cash. She was at $107, which was still $203 short, and the 60-day window was closing. She was beginning to understand that she was not going to be able to solve this alone. The thing that changed everything was a fire, and the fire was not accidental, though it took Opal several days to understand that. It started in the night at the end of August, in the small storage building adjacent to the barn where she kept her grain reserves and equipment. She woke to the smell of smoke and the terrible orange glow against the bedroom window, and she ran out in her nightgown and got the horses out of the barn before the fire could jump. And then she stood in the dark and watched 2 months of stored wheat and $300 worth of equipment burn to the ground, because there was no way to fight a fire that size alone at 2 in the morning. By daylight, when she had the presence of mind to examine what remained, she found something in the ash at the northeast corner of the building. The unmistakable char pattern of a deliberate accelerant, the kind made by oil poured in a trail. She recognized it because she had seen the same pattern on a barn fire in the county 3 years ago that had been ruled deliberate, and the sight of it made her stomach drop so fast she had to put her hand against the burned wall to steady herself. Someone had burned her storage building. Someone who knew it would push her further past the point of no return. She thought of Harlan Dryce. She could not prove it. She knew she could not prove it. But the bone-deep certainty of it settled into her like cold water and did not leave. She was standing in the ruins, her face still smudged with ash, when she heard a horse on her road, and she turned around to see Edgar Quinn riding up on the chestnut mare he'd bought from Henry Calloway. He was not expected, and for a moment she simply stared at him, too exhausted and shaken to compose herself into the self-sufficient posture she had been maintaining for 2 years. He looked at the ruins and his jaw tightened. He looked at her and his eyes moved over her face quickly, taking in the ash, the sleepless night, the way she was holding herself together by pure force of will. He got down from the horse. "Henry told me you'd had trouble," he said. "I came to see if you needed a hand." Opal had opened her mouth to say that she was fine, thank you. She had everything in hand, the automatic refusal that had become her default in 2 years of accepting no help from anyone. But what came out instead, because she was standing in the ruins of her burned storage building at 8 in the morning after no sleep, was the truth. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she said. It was the first honest thing she had said to another person in longer than she could remember, and the relief of it was so sudden and so complete that she had to look away quickly to prevent herself from doing something she would have found unforgivable, like crying in front of a near stranger. Edgar Quinn did not say anything immediately, which she later came to understand was characteristic of him. He thought before he spoke, and he did not fill silences with noise. He walked over to the ruins and crouched and examined the northeast corner. She watched him see what she had seen. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a subtle tightening that told her he had understood the implication. "This fire wasn't an accident," he said. "It was not a question." "No," she said. "I don't believe it was." He stood up and turned to face her, and she met his eyes for the first time without looking away immediately. And what she saw in them was not pity, which she could not have borne, and not the particular kind of false comfort that men sometimes offered women in distress as a way of not having to deal with the reality of the situation. What she saw was attention, clean, direct, honest attention, as if she were a problem worth taking seriously. "Tell me what's happening," he said. And so she did. She told him about the loan and the lien. She told him about the letters from the attorney. She told him about her attempts to raise the money and how far short she remained. She told him about Harlan Dryce, and as she talked she watched Edgar Quinn's face for the reaction that sometimes came from men when women spoke plainly about business and law, the slight condescension, the suggestion that perhaps she had misunderstood. It did not come. He listened to everything she said, and when she was finished he was quiet for a moment. "Harlan Dryce," he said. "I know that name." "Everyone in Sumner County knows it," Opal said. "Whether they'll say it out loud is another matter. He burned the building to reduce your ability to raise funds before the deadline," Edgar said, not speculating, stating. "That is my belief," Opal said carefully. Edgar Quinn nodded once slowly. "I'm going to help you," he said, "if you'll allow it." She should have refused again. Every habit she had built in 2 years said to refuse. But something in the way he said it, not offering charity, not being presumptuous, but asking permission, treating her autonomy as a real thing, made her say instead, "Why would you do that?" He considered the question with the same seriousness he seemed to give to everything. "Because what's happening to you isn't right," he said, "and because I've seen this particular method before. A man like Dryce doesn't stop with one widow. He'll do it to the next one and the one after that if nobody stands in the way." It was not a romantic declaration. It was practical and clear, and it was, she thought, exactly true. It was also, without either of them knowing it yet, the beginning of everything. Edgar Quinn began by making himself useful in the most concrete ways possible. He could not work for her full time. He was still employed at the Morrison operation, and he was a man who honored his commitments. But he came on his days off, and some evenings after his work was done, and he brought with him a set of skills that nearly a decade of trail driving, ranch work, and a childhood on a Missouri farm had given him. He helped her assess the damage from the fire and salvage what could be salvaged. He helped her rebuild the storage structure with lumber bought at a reduced price from a supplier in Caldwell who had known Robert. He did these things without making her feel dependent or diminished, which was a more delicate art than she had expected from a man she barely knew. They talked while they worked. That was how they learned each other, not in any formal way, not through the careful social performances of drawing rooms and Sunday dinners, but through the honest and unglamorous intimacy of shared labor. She learned that he was 31, from Cowboy County, Missouri, the second of 4 brothers, that he had spent 8 years driving cattle up from Texas before settling into ranch management, that he was the kind of man who read books when he could get them, and who had opinions about things, about the rights of the Cherokee and the Creek nations whose lands had been taken to make way for the very cattle trails he had ridden, about the unfairness of the land laws that made it easy for speculators like Dryce to prey on homesteaders, about the way that money and legal paperwork could be weaponized as effectively as any gun. She told him things too. She told him about growing up in Lawrence, Kansas, where she had been born 2 years before the Civil War, the daughter of an abolitionist printer who had raised her to read and think and form her own conclusions. She told him about meeting Robert at a church social when she was 22, about the years she had spent helping him build the farm up from bare land, about the grief that was not simple or clean, but complicated by the secret debt he had left her, and the complicated feelings that secret had produced the hurt of it, the anger that she had tried not to feel because it seemed disloyal to a dead man, but that was there nonetheless. "It's not disloyal to feel it," Edgar said one evening when they were sitting on the porch after a long afternoon's work, the sky going rose and amber over the western fields. "He made a choice that affected your life without telling you. You can love him and be angry about that at the same time." She looked at him for a moment. "You say that as if it's simple," she said. "It is simple," he said. "Simple doesn't mean easy." She turned back to the sunset. "No," she said after a moment. "It doesn't." She was becoming aware, somewhere in the back of her mind, of something that she was not ready to examine yet. It had to do with the way the evenings had started to feel different from the days, slower, softer, as if the work was the excuse and the talking was the actual thing. It had to do with the fact that she noticed when his horse turned up the road before she could logically have expected him, and that there was something that happened in her chest when she saw it. She had felt this once before, at 22, and she knew what it was, and she was terrified of it with a directness that surprised her, because she had not thought she was the kind of woman who was afraid of things like this. She was not afraid of Harlan Dryce. She was not afraid of poverty or hard work or the vast indifferent landscape of the Kansas plains, but the idea of opening herself to the possibility of caring again, of allowing herself to want something that could be taken away, that was a different order of fear entirely, and it went bone deep. She kept working. She kept talking to Edgar Quinn in the evenings on the porch. She did not examine the feeling any further. Meanwhile, the problem of Harlan Dryce was not getting smaller. In September, Opal received a second letter from Dryce's attorney, this one less polite than the first. It informed her that, as the 60-day window had now passed, the lien was in effect, and that formal proceedings to claim the property would begin unless she remitted payment in full, now escalated by additional legal fees to $330 within 30 days. She was sitting at the kitchen table with this letter when Edgar knocked on the door. She let him in and put the letter in front of him and watched him read it. He read it twice, which she had learned was his habit with things that mattered. He gave them a second pass to make sure he hadn't missed anything. "He's accelerating," Edgar said. "He's been patient long enough," Opal said. "He wants the property before winter sets in." Edgar set the letter down. There was a muscle working in his jaw that she had started to recognize. It meant he was turning something over, weighing options. "I want to go to Wichita," he said. She looked at him. "What's in Wichita?" "Land Records Office," he said. "And a lawyer I know man named Aldridge. He does property law. I want to have him look at the original loan document, specifically at the provision about the lien. Those kinds of instruments are only valid if they meet certain requirements under Kansas territorial law, and Dryce's people have been writing these things fast. They're not always clean." Opal felt something move in her chest, not hope exactly, because she had disciplined herself against hope since July, but something adjacent to it. "Do you think there's something there?" she said. "I think it's worth examining," he said carefully. "I don't want to promise you anything I'm not sure of." That precision, she thought, the care not to give her false comfort. "All right," she said. "When?" "I can go Thursday if Morrison will give me the day. I'll need a copy of the document." He paused. "And I'd like you to come with me if you're willing. It's your property. You should be the one in the room." No one had said that to her in 2 years, that she should be the one in the room. Robert had always been the one in the room, or at least he had always assumed he would be, and she had let him, and she was only now understanding what she had surrendered by doing so. "I'll come," she said. They rode to Wichita on Thursday, 2 hours east on the stage road, and Opal sat in the Land Records Office with Aldridge, who was a lean, quick-eyed man of about 50 who smelled of pipe tobacco, and had the look of someone who had read more documents than most people had read words, and she watched him go through the loan instrument with a methodical thoroughness that was both tedious and mesmerizing. Edgar Quinn sat quietly in the corner and did not speak while Aldridge worked. Opal sat straight in the chair across from the desk, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed, watching the lawyer's expression for any shift. It came about 20 minutes in, a slight change in the angle of Aldridge's head, a stillness that preceded attention. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, "when was this document notarized?" She told him the date Robert had mentioned, April of 1880. "The notary stamp is from a Kansas City firm," Aldridge said, not looking up. "Hargrove and Associates." "Yes," she said, "I saw that. Hargrove and Associates lost their commission in February of 1880, Aldridge said, looking up now. "They were decertified by the state of Missouri following a fraud investigation. Any document they notarized after that date is not legally valid in the state of Kansas." The room was very quiet. "Are you saying," Opal said, and her voice was level and controlled because the alternative was some far less dignified expression of emotion, "that the lien provision is unenforceable?" "I'm saying that the notarization on this document is fraudulent," Aldridge said, "and that without valid notarization, the lien provision does not meet the legal requirements for enforceability under Kansas statute. The original debt obligation may still exist. Your husband did borrow the money, and that's real. But Dryce cannot use this document to claim your land." She looked at Edgar Quinn, who was looking at her, and something passed between them that was too large and too complicated to be reduced to an expression. "He knew," Edgar said quietly. "Dryce knew the notarization was invalid. He's been using a fraudulent document to pressure you." "Which means," Opal said, the full shape of the thing coming into view, "that he needed me to not know. He needed me to believe it was valid long enough to either pay him or give up." "Correct," Aldridge said. "And I would argue that using a fraudulent legal instrument to extort a property from its rightful owner is itself a crime, Mrs. Lawson. We could pursue this." She thought about the burned storage building. She thought about the 2 letters written in the careful language of inevitability, designed to make her believe she had no choice. She thought about how close she had come to selling the South pasture, to begging for money, to the edge of true desperation. She thought about Harlan Dryce's pale, triumphant eyes in every story Robert had ever told about him. "Yes," she said, "we will pursue this." Aldridge advised caution and process. He said that she should make no payments and issue no further correspondence with Dryce's attorney until he had prepared the appropriate legal response. He said this could take several weeks, but that her position was strong. He said she should keep any evidence she had of the fire in case it became relevant to a broader case of intimidation and fraud. He charged her $12 for the consultation, which was half his usual fee, and Edgar Quinn, when she was not looking, paid the other half. She found this out 3 days later, from something Henry Calloway said in passing. She rode over to the Morrison operation that afternoon and found Edgar in the corral working with a young quarter horse, and she did not announce herself but simply stood at the fence until he noticed her, and then she said, without preamble, "You paid half of Aldridge's fee." He finished what he was doing with the horse before he answered, which was exactly the kind of response she had come to expect from him. He came to the fence and rested his arms on the top rail and looked at her with a directness that she found she could no longer be flustered by, because she had been looking at it long enough that it had become simply the way his eyes worked. "I did," he said. "Why?" she said. "Because you've been carrying this alone for 2 years and you shouldn't have to," he said. "And because $6 is nothing to me and everything to you right now. And because," he stopped. "Because," she said. He looked at her across the fence rail in the afternoon light, and the quiet stretched between them, and in the quiet was the truth that they had both been not quite saying for 6 weeks. "Because I would rather spend money on a problem that affects you than on most things I can think of," he said. She held his gaze. She felt the thing in her chest she had been refusing to name. "Edgar," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like acknowledging something. "Opal," he said, and the way he said it carefully, like something worth protecting, made her heart do something she had thought it had forgotten how to do. She could not respond to the feeling yet. The ground was still unstable. There was still Harlan Dryce. There was still the legal process. She was not a woman who could afford to let her heart run ahead of her circumstances, and she knew it. But she stopped pretending she didn't know what was between them, and she thought she could tell from the slight release in Edgar Quinn's expression that he understood that. "Thank you," she said, "for the $6 and for the rest of it." "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." She rode home in the golden late afternoon, and for the first time since she had read that first legal letter in July, she felt something that was not the weight of dread. It was tentative and she didn't fully trust it yet, but it was real. Aldridge's letter to Dryce's attorney went out in the first week of October. It was a masterpiece of controlled legal threat. It laid out the fraud charge, cited the relevant Kansas statutes, referenced the investigative history of Hargrove and Associates, and made clear that Mrs. Opal Lawson had no legal obligation under the instrument in question, and that any further attempts to claim the property or harass her through fraudulent legal proceedings would be met with criminal prosecution. 3 days after that letter was delivered, a message came back through an intermediary, not from Dryce's attorney but from Dryce himself, handwritten, which told Opal that the letter had rattled him. The message said that there had been a misunderstanding about the validity of the notarization, and that Dryce was prepared to discuss settlement of the original debt on flexible terms. Settlement on flexible terms, as if he were doing her a favor. She wrote back herself, without consulting Aldridge for the wording, because the message required a certain personal quality that legal language could not supply. She wrote, "Mr. Dryce, I will not be discussing settlement. The debt, if it legally exists at all, will be addressed through the courts if you wish to pursue it through legitimate means. What will also be addressed through the courts, if you force me to it, is the matter of the fraudulent document, the calculation behind its presentation to me as valid, and the fire of late August which destroyed my storage building under circumstances that leave no question about their deliberate nature. I trust you will find the mathematics of this unfavorable. Opal Lawson." She gave it to the stage driver to carry to Wichita and felt, as the envelope passed from her hand, a surge of righteous satisfaction that was, she thought, one of the finer feelings available to the human animal. And then, because he was exactly the kind of man she had always known him to be, Harlan Dryce came to her farm in person. Which brought everything back to that October morning, to the black horse and the gold pin and the official document and the triumphant pale eyes, and to Opal frozen at the window, unable to speak, and to the front door opening before she could reach it. Edgar Quinn was standing on her porch. She had not known he was there. She had not heard his horse come up the road. She found out later that he had seen Dryce's black horse tied at the Caldwell Hotel the evening before and had put together what it meant. That Dryce was not retreating but escalating, choosing confrontation over correspondence, and he had ridden out to the farm before dawn and waited, because that was the kind of man Edgar Quinn was. He did not make speeches about what he would do. He simply did it. Harlan Dryce looked at Edgar for a long moment, the kind of look that travels from a man's boots to his hat and makes calculations about his weight and age and likely reach. Dryce was not a physical man himself, which was how he had arranged things. He had a man with him, a heavy-set person with a scarred face who had ridden behind him and dismounted with the measured ease of someone paid for exactly this kind of situation. Opal came through the door and stood behind Edgar's right shoulder. She had composed herself by the time the door frame was behind her. Her face was set and her eyes were fixed on Dryce with an expression that she was aware, even in the extremity of the moment, contained significantly more contempt than fear. "Mrs. Lawson," Dryce said, shifting his gaze to her, "I came to settle this personally." "You received my letter," she said. "I received your letter," he agreed pleasantly. "It was creative. Aldridge is clever, but I came to show you something." He held up the document again, not the loan instrument she realized, but something else, a different paper. "This is a deed," he said, transferring ownership of this property to the Dryce Land and Cattle Company, signed by Robert Lawson in March of 1880. Opal felt the cold move through her. She had not known about this. Robert had not told her. "That's a forgery," Edgar said, and his voice was absolutely flat, as if he were describing a weather fact. Dryce's pleasant expression didn't change. "It's a legal instrument signed by the property owner." "Let me see it," Opal said. She stepped around Edgar's shoulder and walked forward 3 paces into the yard because she was not going to look at the document that someone was claiming had signed away her land from 10 feet away. She held out her hand. Dryce looked at her extended hand, and something moved behind his pale eyes, surprise, perhaps, that she was advancing rather than retreating. He gave her the paper. She read it carefully. She was good at reading documents now, and she took her time. The deed was written correctly and notarized by a different firm, one she didn't recognize. Robert's signature was at the bottom. It looked like Robert's signature. It was possible it was Robert's signature. It was also possible that a man as well-resourced as Harlan Dryce could produce a forged signature that would fool a casual examination. She looked at the notary stamp. The firm's name was Callaway & Webb, with a Wichita address and a date of March 12, 1880. She handed the document back to Dryce, turned around, walked back to the porch. "This document was notarized by the same firm that was decertified in February of 1880, she said. "Callaway & Webb are a subsidiary of Hargrove & Associates, which our attorney has already documented. You've made the same mistake twice, Mr. Dryce. Either because you underestimated me, or because you simply don't have anything else." Dryce's pleasant expression faltered for the first time. "I suggest," Edgar said from the porch, and his voice was quiet enough that Dryce had to almost lean in to hear it, "that you ride back to Wichita and tell your attorney to expect a criminal complaint within the week, and take your man with you." The heavy-set man with the scarred face looked at Edgar Quinn with the professional, measuring attention of someone accustomed to assessing threats. He looked for a long moment. Then he looked at Dryce. Dryce put the document back in his coat. He looked at Opal for a moment, and what was in his eyes was no longer triumph. It was the flat, recalculating look of a man adjusting to a world that had turned out not to match his predictions. "This isn't finished," Dryce said. "It is," Opal said, "and I think you know it." He held her gaze for 3 more seconds, which was 3 seconds too long, and they both knew it. Then he turned, went to his horse, and mounted. His man mounted without a word. They rode back down the road the way they had come, and the dust rose and settled, and the sound of hooves faded, and then there was just the open Kansas sky and the grass moving in the October wind and the silence, which was the finest thing Opal had heard in weeks. She stayed where she was in the yard until she was absolutely certain she could speak without her voice shaking. It took approximately 30 seconds. Then she turned around and looked at Edgar Quinn on the porch, and the 30 seconds of composure she had assembled cracked directly down the middle. "That deed," she said, "Dryce wrote it himself, didn't he?" "Almost certainly," Edgar said. He had come down the porch steps and was standing in the yard now, close enough that she would have had to take only 1 step to close the distance between them. "Robert didn't sell the farm," she said, not asking, confirming. "No," Edgar said. "He didn't." She nodded. She pressed her lips together. "He also didn't tell me about the loan," she said. "He also didn't tell me a lot of things." The complicated feeling was back, the love and the anger and the grief, all tangled together, impossible to separate. "Opal," Edgar said, and his voice was so careful, so precise, so exactly calibrated to the particular weight of the moment that she had to look away before she looked back. "I know," she said. "I know it's simple. Simple doesn't mean easy." He had said that to her 6 weeks ago, and she was giving it back to him, and the recognition of it passed between them like a thing with heat and weight. He was looking at her and she was looking at him, and the October wind moved across the open land and she took the step. She did not plan it. She was not the kind of person who acted without planning. She had learned 2 years ago to think before she moved, to calculate, to never spend what she couldn't afford. But she took the step, and the distance between them closed, and Edgar Quinn's arms came around her and she pressed her face against the front of his work coat and breathed. She did not cry. She was not crying. She was simply allowing herself, for the first time since the afternoon she had stood in the January cold and known that Robert was not coming home, to be held. And the thing that she felt in that moment was not desperation or loneliness or even gratitude, though all of those were present. The thing she felt was, impossibly and terrifyingly and completely like home. He held her. He didn't speak. His hand came to the back of her head, careful, sure, as if this were not the first time but simply one time in a long sequence of times, as if they had always been here and had simply been waiting to arrive. They stayed like that for a minute, or perhaps longer, with the wind moving around them and the farm stretching out in every direction under the October sky. Then Opal straightened, and Edgar's arms loosened but did not entirely let go, and she looked at him with a directness that she suspected, if she had seen herself in a mirror, would have told her more than she was ready to know. "We still need to deal with Dryce properly," she said. "Yes," he said. "And the original loan debt," she said. "Even if the lien is invalid, $250 is a real thing Robert borrowed." "I know," he said. "I intend to pay it," she said, "through legitimate channels at a fair interest rate when I have the means. I'm not going to pretend the debt doesn't exist because the document is fraudulent." He looked at her steadily. "That's who you are," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that was not surprise but rather something deeper than that, the recognition of a quality he had been watching develop into certainty. "Yes," she said, "it is." He did not release her entirely for another moment, and neither of them moved to step back, and the fact of where his hands were and where she was standing felt like a declaration neither of them had made aloud yet, but that was no less real for the silence around it. "Edgar," she said. "Still here," he said. "I know you are," she said. "That's the thing." Aldridge's legal response moved through the proper channels with the satisfying inevitability of a correctly calculated mechanism. He documented the fraudulent notarization of both instruments, the connection between the decertified Hargrove and Associates and the subsidiary firm that had notarized the deed, and presented the complete case to the Sumner County District Court in November. He also engaged a Wichita investigator to examine the origins of the fire at Opal's storage building, and while proof was always difficult in these matters, the investigator produced testimony from a Caldwell Hotel employee that Dryce's man had purchased lamp oil 2 days before the fire in a quantity that had no obvious explanation. The fraud charges were filed in December. Harlan Dryce hired the best attorney in Wichita, which said something about how seriously he was taking it. The case would not come to trial until spring, which meant Opal spent the winter in a state of legal suspense, but it was a suspense of a fundamentally different character than what had preceded it. She was the one with the legitimate position now, and she knew it, and Dryce knew she knew it. He made no further direct contact with her. His attorney filed one counterclaim arguing that the notarization issue had been an administrative oversight and that the instruments reflected real agreements, and Aldridge filed back with 6 different points of rebuttal that dismantled the oversight argument thoroughly. The legal volleys continued through December and January, while the Kansas winter settled over the plains in its gray and uncompromising way. Edgar Quinn had finished his contract with the Morrison operation in November, and the question of what came next was the quiet, large question that lived at the edge of everything during those months. He had been offered a permanent position at a ranch outside Dodge City, better pay, more responsibility, a manager's role that was the logical next step in the career he had been building. He told Opal about it one evening in late November, the two of them sitting at her kitchen table with coffee, and the wood stove throwing heat against the winter dark outside the windows. She received the information with the careful neutrality of a woman who understood that her face was communicating more than her words, and who was not ready to resolve that conflict. "It's a good opportunity," she said. "It is," he said. "You should take it," she said, and hated herself slightly for the evenness of her delivery. "Is that what you want?" he said. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved across the open land in the way it always did in November, as if it had specific grievances with Kansas. "No," she said. "It is not what I want." The word arrived between them with the weight of a thing that had been a long time accumulating. He watched her face, and she looked at him directly because she was done with not looking at him directly. "What do you want?" he said, and his voice was as careful as it always was, but underneath the care was something she recognized as identical to what was in her own chest, the same terrible, clarifying want. "I want you to stay in Caldwell," she said. "I want you to keep coming to this table on evenings when the work is done, and I want to keep talking to you the way we talk. I want," she paused because the next part was harder. "I want the right to call you mine," she said, "if you want that." He was quiet for long enough that she had time to feel the full exposure of what she had said, standing in the cold air of her own honesty without any cover. "Opal Lawson," he said. "I have wanted that since about the 3rd week I knew you, and I have been trying to give you the time to come to it on your own terms, because you are a woman who needs to come to her conclusions on her own terms, and I was not going to rush you. But if you are telling me now that you're there, then I would very much like you to know that I would sooner walk away from the Dodge City position than from you." She felt something unknot in the center of her chest that she had not known was knotted. "Then don't go to Dodge City," she said. "I won't," he said. He reached across the table and took her hand, both of his hands around hers, the same way she'd had both hands around the coffee cup, as if she were something worth warming. She looked at their hands and then at his face, and she thought, "This is real. After 2 years of surviving and fighting and holding herself together, this is a real thing that is mine." She turned her hand over inside his and held on. He found work in Sumner County. There was no shortage of it. He was skilled and reliable and had a reputation that preceded him. And by January, he had a part-time arrangement with 2 ranches and was making enough to get by. He did not move onto her property, because they were not married, and it was 1883, and Caldwell was a small enough community that such arrangements carried consequences. She was not willing to impose on either of them. But he came almost every evening, and on Sundays, and the nature of what was between them was no longer secret or ambiguous. The town knew, with the efficient knowledge that small towns always acquire about such things, and the town's opinion was largely that Edgar Quinn seemed a good man, and that Opal Lawson had earned something good after the years she'd had. There were a few dissenters, as there always are, who felt that a widow ought to wait longer before receiving a man's attentions. Opal's response to this opinion, when it reached her through the intermediate stage of Mrs. Calloway mentioning it apologetically over a fence post in December, was brief and entirely characteristic. "I'm 28 years old, not 8. I appreciate the concern." The Dryce case came to trial in March of 1884. The courtroom in Caldwell was not a place built for drama. It was a plain wood-frame room with hard benches, and a judge's bench that looked like it had been built from the same lumber as the church pews. But it had its drama anyway. Aldridge presented the case methodically and completely, and the judge, a thin, impatient man named Abernathy who had seen enough land fraud in his 20 years on the bench to be neither surprised by it nor sympathetic to it, listened with close attention. The defense argued that the notarization errors were administrative oversights, and that the underlying agreements were valid. Aldridge produced the investigative history of Hargrove and Associates with particular relish. He produced a handwriting analysis of Robert Lawson's signature, conducted by an expert from Kansas City, comparing the signature on the deed to known samples of Robert's actual handwriting, and the expert's conclusion was that the deed signature showed several characteristics inconsistent with the authentic samples. He produced the hotel employee testimony about the lamp oil. He produced a pattern of similar instruments from 3 other Sumner County properties, where Dryce had used the same notary stamp, all of which were under legal challenge. Harlan Dryce sat at the defendant's table and looked at the ceiling sometimes, at his attorney sometimes, and occasionally at Opal, who sat in the front row of the gallery and met his gaze with the same steady, undramatic attention she had given him in the yard in October, the gaze of a person who is not afraid, and has not been afraid for some time, and simply has no patience left for the pretense. Judge Abernathy ruled on the last Friday of March. The fraudulent notarization of both instruments rendered them unenforceable. The original debt of $250 was real and should be settled through a legitimate civil proceeding if Dryce wished to pursue it. The evidence surrounding the fire, while not conclusive, was sufficient to warrant referral to the county prosecutor for further investigation of possible arson. The pattern of similar instruments from other properties suggested a deliberate fraud scheme rather than administrative oversight, and the judge was referring that element of the case to the state attorney general's office. Harlan Dryce was not arrested in the courtroom. That was not how such things worked, and Aldridge had explained this to Opal in advance so that she would not expect a dramatic conclusion to arrive on that particular afternoon. The referrals would take time. The state investigation would take longer. But the farm was hers, clearly and unambiguously, and with the full weight of the court's finding behind it, and the mechanisms of formal accountability were now in motion, and Harlan Dryce had walked into that courtroom believing he could still manage the outcome and was walking out knowing he could not. She watched him go. She felt the long, slow release of a tension she had been carrying for 9 months. Edgar was beside her in the gallery, and he had been there for the whole of the trial, 2 days, sitting exactly to her right in the hard benches, present and still and there. When Judge Abernathy's ruling was concluded, she turned to look at Edgar, and he was already looking at her. She had not prepared anything to say. She said the thing that was actually true. "It's over." "It's over," he said. She exhaled, long, complete down to the very bottom. He put his arm around her shoulders in the courtroom with 40 other people present, and she leaned into it without any self-consciousness at all, because she was too tired for self-consciousness and too relieved and too full of the specific warmth of his arm to care about anything else. Outside the courthouse, in the clear March light, Henry Calloway shook Edgar's hand and embraced Opal, and other people from the county who had testified or come to observe offered their congratulations. And Aldridge said something dry and satisfied about the rightness of the outcome and the general incompetence of Dryce's legal team. And the afternoon went by in the pleasant, disorganized way of afternoons that follow good news. She paid what she owed to the original debt on Robert's loan, $250, plus fair interest at 6% per year, which was the standard bank rate, totaling $310 by the time she had the full amount together. She paid it through Aldridge to Dryce's estate account without a single word of complaint, because the debt was real even if the document had been fraudulent, and she was not the kind of person who settled her obligations by looking for reasons not to. It took her until the fall of 1884 to raise the full amount. She sold the south pasture, not because she had to, but because the calculation now made sense, and the money she cleared on the sale allowed her to pay the debt, improve the north irrigation, and still have $60 in reserve for the first time in 3 years. She was standing in the north field on the afternoon she got the receipt of payment back from Aldridge, with the land stretching out around her in the September gold, and she thought, "This is mine." Not in the defiant, fighting way she had been thinking it all year, just simply, quietly, finally. Mine. Edgar had come down from the north fence where he had been working, and he came to stand beside her, and she showed him the receipt without a word. He read it. He looked up. He looked at her with those dark, careful eyes that she knew now as well as she knew anything in the world. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking," she said, "that it's finished. All of it." The debt, the legal case, all of it. She paused, and I'm thinking that I don't want to spend any more time alone. He was very still in the way he went still when something had weight. The sun was making the dry grass golden around them, and the sky was enormous and blue the way it only gets in September in Kansas when the heat has broken and the air is clean and the days are exactly right. "Opal Lawson," he said. "Edgar Quinn," she said. "I would very much like to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," she said. He turned to face her fully, and she turned to face him, and they were standing in the north field with the wind in the grass around them, and the particular silence of open land that is not empty but alive. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because of the farm or the debt or any of what has passed this year. Because of the evenings at that table, and the way you told me the truth in the burned building that first morning, and the way you walked into Dryce's yard, and held out your hand for the document, and the way you said my name when you're thinking through a problem. Because I have never known anyone like you, and I do not want to know anyone else." She felt the thing in her chest fully, completely, without any of the restraint she had been applying to it for the better part of a year. It was large and warm and entirely unfrightening, which surprised her because she had thought she would still be afraid. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." He stepped forward and his arms came around her and she put her face against his shoulder. And the September wind moved across the north field. And somewhere in the far distance, she could hear the faint sound of cattle moving on the trail, the old sound of the country, the sound that had been there before either of them and would be there long after. And it was the most beautiful background to a moment she had ever heard. They were married in November of 1884 in Caldwell, at the Methodist Church, where she had attended services for 3 years, without particularly thinking about what occasion might justify the full use of its nave. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Aldies, who had a warm, somewhat theatrical delivery style that filled the wood-frame building with more feeling than Opal had expected. Henry Calloway stood up with Edgar, and Sarah Greer, the bank president's wife, who had been kinder to Opal in the past year than Opal had given her credit for, stood beside Opal. The church was full, because by November the whole county had made up its mind about Edgar Quinn and Opal Lawson and wanted to register its approval, and the occasion had taken on a festive quality that surprised Opal in the best possible way. She wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had made herself 3 years earlier and which had been waiting in the back of the wardrobe for a reason to exist. She had put her dark hair up in a way she had not done since Robert's funeral, for almost entirely opposite reasons. When she came down the aisle of the Methodist Church in Caldwell, Kansas, on a November Saturday in 1884, with the light coming through the plain glass windows and every seat in the building occupied, she was not a widow anymore, not in the way that word had defined her for 3 years. She was a woman walking towards something she had chosen, fully and freely, and with her eyes open. Edgar Quinn was waiting for her at the front, and the look on his face when he saw her was the kind of look that a woman keeps in the precise center of her memory for the rest of her life. Not for what it said about her appearance, but for what it said about her, entirely, about the specific person she was, about the fact that he saw her and was grateful beyond any easy expression to be seeing her. The ceremony was traditional and proper, and when Reverend Aldies pronounced them married, the church produced the particular warm sound of a room full of people who are genuinely happy for the people at the front. And Edgar Quinn kissed her in front of everyone with a precision and a reverence that made Sarah Greer catch her breath, which Opal heard and remembered and treasured later. They rode home to the farm in the afternoon light, side by side in the wagon, and the journey that she had made hundreds of times alone felt different in every way possible when made with another person beside her. Not because the road had changed, but because she had, and the word alone no longer applied. That winter was nothing like the winters that had come before. The farmhouse was the same farmhouse, same walls, same stove, same windows that let in the cold at the edges and had to be banked with rags, but the presence in it was different. There were 2 pairs of boots by the door. There were 2 coffee cups on the table every morning. There was someone to tell things to and someone to hear things from, and the silence that had been so absolute and sometimes so terrible in the 2 winters of her widowhood was now simply what it actually was, the quiet of a house that holds people who are comfortable together. Edgar had a gift for domestic peace that she had not expected, having known him first in the context of labor and legal crisis. He was, in the ordinary rhythms of daily life, a man of good humor and considerable patience. He read aloud sometimes in the evenings from whatever book was on hand. There was a copy of David Copperfield that had traveled with him from Missouri, and that she loved unreservedly, and his reading voice was low and steady, and she sometimes listened less to the actual words than to the sound of him in the room. He cooked 2 things extremely well and everything else adequately, which she found deeply charming compared to her own comprehensive competence, which he found equally charming, and they arranged the kitchen accordingly. They talked about everything: the farm, what it needed, what the South pasture sale had made possible, what the next 5 years could look like if the cattle market held, the legal situation with Dryce, which was still unresolved at the state level but was moving slowly through the appropriate mechanisms. Edgar's past, the years on the trail, the cattle drives up from Texas, the vast lonesome beauty of the open range that he had loved and that he did not miss precisely, but that had made him who he was. Opal's past, Lawrence and her father's printing press, and the particular education of growing up in a household that believed words and ideas were the most important things in the world, and what she had made of that belief on a Kansas wheat farm. They talked about justice. It was one of the things they had in common, an orientation toward fairness that was not abstract but practical, tied to what they had each seen in the world. Edgar had ridden with Cherokee freedmen on cattle drives and had his own clear opinions about the dispossession that the settlement of Kansas had required, opinions that he stated directly and without apology. Opal's father had published abolitionist pamphlets in a city that had been burned for its politics, and she had come to her convictions about human dignity early and kept them without erosion. They did not always agree on every particular, but the foundation was the same, and arguing from the same foundation, they discovered, is entirely different from arguing across different ones. Spring came early and warm in 1885, which was the kind of gift that farming people accept with gratitude and slight suspicion. The North Field, with the improved irrigation, produced a wheat crop that was the best Opal had seen on the property in her 6 years of working it. Edgar had taken on a formal management role with one of the county ranches, which kept him engaged and paid well without demanding the kind of absence that trail driving had required, and the balance of his work and the farm and the life they were building felt, by midsummer, like something she had designed like it had been made to fit. She knew she was expecting in August. She told Edgar on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen, with the light coming in from the east and the coffee hot on the stove, and the look on his face was something she filed next to the look from the church in November in the center of her memory, where she kept the things that mattered most. He had not expected it, they had not spoken of it directly, though they had certainly not been trying to prevent it, and the surprise moved through his expression, and then resolved into something so unguarded and purely glad that she had to look down at her coffee cup for a moment. "Opal," he said. "I know," she said. He got up from the table and came around to her and put his arms around her from behind, very carefully, as if the caution were already appropriate, and pressed his face against her hair. She put her hands over his arms and held them there. "Are you well?" he said. "Absolutely," she said. "I'm strong as a horse and I intend to stay that way." "I know you are," he said. "I know you will be." He was quiet for a moment. "I can't believe it," he said. "I simply can't believe how lucky I am." She turned her head slightly to look at him from the side. "We are," she said. "We are," he agreed. "Absolutely, completely we." The pregnancy was, as she had promised, uncomplicated by any drama on her part. She worked the farm through the autumn with appropriate modifications, and Edgar took on the heavier tasks without being asked and without making it a production, which was entirely consistent with his character. The county women offered various forms of advice and assistance, some of which she welcomed, and some of which she declined with perfect politeness. Harlan Dryce was charged by the state attorney general's office in October of 1885 with a consolidated fraud case involving 8 Sumner County properties. The charge included the 2 instruments he had used against Opal, the fire investigation having ultimately produced enough evidence to include an accessory charge for the arson. He would be tried in Wichita in the spring. The state's case was described by Aldridge, who had been consulted in the preparation, as extremely strong. Opal received this news and sat with it for a few minutes at the kitchen table. She was aware of the satisfying closure of it, the machinery of accountability that had been set in motion in March of 1884 arriving, 18 months later, at its proper destination. She was also aware that she had spent exactly long enough on Harlan Dryce, and that the time he occupied in her mental landscape was now appropriately minimal. He had been the defining threat of a certain period of her life. That period was over. Their son was born in December of 1885 in the farmhouse, in the cold of a Kansas winter that had decided to come in hard. The birth was attended by Dr. Henley from Caldwell, who arrived in time to be useful, and by Sarah Greer, who had become a genuine friend over the course of 1884 and 1885 and who proved, in the particular crucible of a birth, to be exactly the kind of person Opal would have chosen to have in the room. Edgar was in the house. He was not in the room, the proprieties of 1885 did not permit it, but she was aware of his presence just beyond the door throughout, and once, near the end, when things were difficult and she needed the particular grounding force of knowing he was there, she called his name. He answered immediately from the other side of the door. Right here. 2 words. Exactly the right 2 words. The boy arrived in the early morning hours, healthy and indignant, and possessed of a cry that made Dr. Henley nod with professional approval. She held him and looked at him in the lamplight, and he was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen, not because of any idea she had had about what a child of hers would be, but because of the absolute specific reality of him, his furious aliveness, the improbable fact of his presence in a world that had been, 2 years ago, mostly made of loss. They let Edgar in. He came through the door carefully, as if he might break something which was not at all like him, and then he saw the boy and something happened in his face that was entirely beyond her capacity to describe. A softening and an expansion all at once, a kind of opening. He sat down beside her on the bed and she put the boy in his arms, and he held him with the same sure, careful hands that he brought to everything and looked down at his son. "Hello," he said to the boy, quietly as if they were being introduced. "Hello, I'm your father." She was watching his face. She was not sure she had ever loved anything more precisely in that particular moment than she loved Edgar Quinn. They named him Robert James Quinn Robert for the man who had worked this land before them and loved it, whatever his failures had been, and James for Edgar's father, who had died in Missouri 7 years ago, and whose name Edgar had said once with the kind of quiet reverence that requires no elaboration. Harlan Dryce was convicted in the Wichita trial in April of 1886. He was sentenced to 3 years in the state penitentiary and permanently barred from engaging in real property transactions in Kansas. The 8 families whose properties he had attempted to defraud were each given restitution orders from the court. Several of those families had lost their properties before the case broke, and the restitution was not a full remedy for what they had suffered, but it was something, and Opal thought of them when she read about the verdict, and thought about the way a single injustice ripples outward until someone stands still long enough to stop it. She thought about Edgar on her porch on that October morning, standing between her and Dryce before she could speak, and she thought about how that single act, choosing to be there, choosing to stand, had been the pivot point of everything that came after. Not because she had needed a man to save her. She had been fighting this on her own terms from the beginning, and she knew it. But because there are moments when the difference between standing alone and standing with someone changes the entire character of what you're able to do, and that had been one of those moments. She told him this one evening when Robert James was 4 months old and sleeping in the cradle by the stove, and the house was warm and dark, and there was only the fire and the lamp between them. "That morning in October," she said, "when you came through the door before I could. I remember it," he said. "I want you to know," she said, "that it wasn't that I needed rescuing. I want to be clear about that. I know," he said, "you were rescuing yourself. You had been rescuing yourself for months before I knew your name. But that morning," she said, "there was a particular quality to knowing you were there, that you had come out before dawn and waited without me asking, that you chose to be there before you knew what it would cost you." He was watching her in the lamplight. "It didn't cost me anything," he said. "That's why it mattered," she said. He reached across the table, the same way he had that November evening in 1883, with both hands around hers, and she turned her hand over and held on. The years after that had the quality that the best years have, full of events and changes, but none of them catastrophic, all of them part of the ongoing, building work of a life that has found its shape. The farm grew. Edgar's reputation as a ranch manager grew with it, and by 1888 he had been offered and accepted the management of the Callaway Ranch operation when Henry Callaway retired, which allowed him to work close to home and still use every skill he had built in a decade of cattle work. Their daughter arrived in 1888 in the spring, with considerably more composure than her brother had shown at the same occasion, a fact that Dr. Henley observed with amusement, and that Opal thought was entirely characteristic of a child born in April when the world was already in good order. They named her Clara May, for no particular precedent, but because it suited her, and because Edgar said it, and they both knew immediately that it was right. Robert James, at 2 years old, approached his sister with the cautious curiosity of a person confronting something entirely unprecedented in his experience, and then appointed himself her primary guardian and enthusiast, a role he took seriously for the rest of their shared childhood. Opal taught both children to read early. She told them about the farm's history without editing it, about their father Robert Lawson and the land he had built, about the debt and the fraud and the fight, about the injustice that could be done through paper and legal language, and the importance of understanding documents before you signed them. She told them about their father Edgar and how he had stood on the porch. She told them about Harlan Dryce, not to frighten them, but to make sure they understood that the world contained people who would try to use power against those with less of it, and that the answer to such people was not fear but clear eyes, and the right allies, and the willingness to stand your ground. Robert James grew up to be precisely the kind of boy who absorbs lessons without appearing to, a quiet, observant child who was already, at 6, reading things through twice the way his father did. Clara May was vociferous and opinionated, and kept the household in the kind of productive, argumentative energy that Opal's father had always maintained was the mark of an alive intellect. By 1890, the farm was thriving in a way that still occasionally astonished Opal when she let herself think about where it had been in the summer of 1883. The wheat was good and the cattle were good, and the house had 2 rooms added on the back where before there had been 1, and the north field that the improved irrigation had opened up produced consistently well. She had hired a permanent hand, a young man named Absalom Cole, who was 22 and competent and treated with fair wages and respect, and the operation was something Robert had dreamed it could be. Sometimes she walked the property in the evenings by herself, the way she had in the worst of the years, but for entirely different reasons now. She walked it to see it, to stand in the north field and look out at what it had become. To remember standing here in September of 1884 with the receipt in her hand and thinking, mine. To acknowledge that she had never given it up, not in the hardest moment, not when she had $47 and a fraudulent lien and a burned storage building and no clear path forward. She had not given it up because it was Robert's dream and because it had become hers, and because she was not, at her core, a woman who bent. And because, in the darkest part of that fight, a man had come through her door before she could speak, and stood between her and the thing that wanted to take it from her, and had given her the particular and irreplaceable gift of not being alone. One October evening in 1897, years to the month from that morning in the yard, which she had not precisely calculated but which occurred to her with the sideways logic of significant anniversaries, she was standing in the north field watching the last of the light go off the wheat stubble, and she heard footsteps in the grass behind her and knew them before she turned. Edgar came to stand beside her. He put his arm around her shoulders. They looked at the land together. "What are you thinking?" He said, "I'm thinking it's a good farm," she said. "It is," he said, "always was." "I'm thinking about 7 years ago," she said, "that morning." He was quiet for a moment. "So am I," he said. "I was thinking about it on the way out here." She turned to look at him in the evening light, this man who had been walking through her door for 7 years, who had walked through it that first time before she could even reach the handle, and had never stopped being there since. The lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper than they had been in 1883, and his hair had a thread of silver at the temples, and she found both of these developments entirely beautiful. "I want you to know," she said, "all of it, that I know what I have." He looked at her with those careful dark eyes. "So do I," he said, "every day." The wind came across the field the way it always did, moving the dry grass in the old pattern, and the sky was going deep blue, and the first stars were beginning. And Robert James was probably chasing the dog around the yard behind the house, and Clara May was probably arguing with someone or something, and Absalom Cole was probably finishing the evening feeding in the barn, and the farmhouse was lit from inside with the warm light of the stove and the lamp. And the deed to 120 acres of Sumner County grassland had Opal's name on it, and she was standing in the north field with her husband's arm around her, in the October evening of a life that had come through every dark place to arrive here. She leaned into him. He held her. The stars appeared, one and then several and then all of them over the Kansas plain. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make dinner." "In a minute," he said. They stayed a minute longer because some moments deserve a minute longer, and the land was patient and the stars were coming out, and there was nowhere in the world either of them needed to be except exactly here. Then they walked back together through the grass, side by side, to the lit house, to the children, to the ordinary, extraordinary life they had built from the ruins of a hard year and a fraudulent document, and a morning in October when a man had stood on a porch, and a woman had stood in a yard, and the thing between them had been too strong for any court document to touch. The farmhouse door closed behind them. The light stayed on inside. The Kansas night settled over the land like something at peace. This was how it ended, not in drama or crisis, but in the quiet certainty of people who know what they have and hold on to it, who have earned the particular grace of arrival after a long road, who have found in each other not a rescue but a companion, and in that companionship have discovered that the land under their feet and the life they have made on it belong to them, completely and irrevocably, because they fought for it together and they stayed.